Okay guys, so in this video we are going to talk about monoliths. So let's get into it. So basically what we're going to cover here today is going to be when do we split a monolith and what should we think about when we do that split. So this is a bit of a request thing. Well, most of the stuff that I make is a request, but specifically I had a few responses here on an old video. Well, maybe it's not old now, but hey, this video here, monolith versus SOA versus microservices and when to use what. And so the requests were coming in here for pretty much to explain the mindset behind a split. Like, what should we think about? How should we structure things? And that's kind of what we're going to go for today. So I'm going to warn you ahead of time. There's a bit of stuff that, like a bit of theory that I need to go through with you just to get you into the right mind space. And then I'm going to try and demo my mental process for an application that is a completely fake application here, where I have a bunch of endpoints. Now this is just stub data because this is not so much about code as it is about experience and architecture, and that is not something that is going to be directly tied into exactly this endpoint or that endpoint or this framework or that framework. So if you're looking for a technical solution or sort of video here, this is not that video. So basically we're going to walk through the mindset that I'm going to have with me when I try to segment up this application that just simulates a monolithic application. So first and foremost, what we're going to have a look at is when do we split a monolith? Well, the simple answer is that usually this happens when one of the following things are true. You have too many developers touching the same code, or you have a performance-heavy feature that needs to scale individually. Now think about that. The main reason why we want to go from a monolith to a SOA, or a service-oriented architecture, and for those of you who are new to all of this, you can think of SOA as a different version of microservices. You just have a distributed system with different services doing their thing, right? And they're all working together and connecting to each other in order to create some grand super system. And this is how big systems are built. But almost every smaller system, and even some of the larger ones, start out as a monolith, which is just one single application, right? So when that becomes heavy, or where you start experiencing pain with the monolith, that's usually what we call getting into growth ache. Now, the reason for a monolith to grow is usually because of these reasons. You have more developers and therefore your company is successful. Hey, great. So scaling up a monolith is actually a luxury problem because it actually means that your system is growing, and growth is good for a system. So when we're dealing with these sorts of pains that come with the so-called growth ache, we need to start thinking about the reasons for for how this is occurring to begin with, if that makes sense. What I'm basically saying here is that the pains that come from having a growing code base or features that are very heavy or things like that is usually one of the following. Like these pains are, this is not an exhaustive list, but usually things like frequent merge conflicts is a very good indicator that you have one of these two problems here. You have this problem. You have too many developers. So your developers are working, they're all doing their thing, and all of a sudden, I touched some code that my coworker was touching as well, because I am working on one team and they're working on another team, and for some reason there was some conflict here. Okay, then we need to resolve that. And the more code you have and the more developers you have, the more frequent this is going to be, because there's no split between who owns what. And another thing is miscommunication between teams. I've had this happen many times where you have one team that has a story that is supposed to do one thing, and then you have another team that has another story that is doing the same thing or a very similar thing, and they are dependent. It's just that they don't talk to each other for some reason, and they share the same code, so there's no organic forum or way for them to start communicating around the feature. So they both start working on the same code at the same time, and then they realize later on that, this thing that the team A was doing is actually messing up all the stuff that team B is doing, and now we need to resolve that situation. Another one is that teams are blocking other teams from shipping features. That's also very common, where maybe they have communicated and the first team says, oh yeah, we need to do this thing for our feature, and then team B goes, well, but we need to get this in. Okay, but our thing is making changes that is going to affect your changes, so you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait for us to be done with our stuff, and then maybe you can add in your stuff. And now you're delaying the other team. Release coordination is another one where, all right, can we release this code now? Yes, no. Like if you own the code yourself, if it's your small little own product, you probably know. But if you're releasing something and you're not sure who's depending on what, you're going to have to coordinate with the other teams. You're going to have to check, are you all guys ready for me to release all the features now? Is that okay? Is there something that I should know about the system that I don't know? These are the sorts of pains that usually come when you've stayed on the monolith for too long, and now it's time to really start thinking about, all right, should we split this out? And another way, like the other one we were talking about here, is like this is not as common, that it does happen, where you might have a feature that is a really high performance or something that requires a lot of extra processing power or resources or something like that, or maybe it has very different considerations from the main system. And that usually shows itself by, all right, you should basically consider this approach in these two scenarios. Is this new feature going to cause problems for the other features? That's basically the first and most important thing. Because if you have a monolithic application and you have a new feature, the only thing that should make you kind of consider making that thing into a separate service is if you think that this thing here, well, it's going to have special hardware, or it's going to have a lot of CPU processing, like a lot of processing power, something like that. Or maybe it's just a very lightweight thing that you want to spin up that just needs to have the best possible performance. Well, then you may not want to include that in the main project, because you want to have maybe one instance of your monolith and 100 instances of this service. And one other thing to really, this is a big one for the big companies, how will it be costly? Like if you have a new feature that is going to require a lot of specialized resources, then you want to be able to have that as a separate thing that you can kind of manage and scale independently from the main system. So what should we think about when we start thinking about a split? All right, so these are the three questions that I will argue are the baseline of this. Is not, as I said, it's not an exhaustive list. There are many things that you should think about, because splitting is one of the hardest things that you can do, because splitting is just a result of a company growing, and that is what we call the scale up. The scale up is basically a company growing to a point where, all right, now we have so many people and so many features and so much stuff going on that we need to find a way to schedule everything and like make people responsible for different parts. And that's much more complicated than having one small system that you all maintain together. So the first thing you should always ask is, what is the goal of the split? The second thing is, what technical impact will the split have? And third and lastly, how should the split look? This is the big one usually. This is the most important thing of all of this stuff. This other stuff is important, but this is the thing that is the thing that dictates whether or not your company is going to be delivering in weeks or in days or in weeks or in months. It's a very important thing. What is the goal of the split? So first and foremost, you always have to define what the goal is, because if somebody tells you that, oh, we should just split something, and oh, we should just use microservices, what that basically means is that that person is basically just saying that, oh, I don't really know what the goal here is. I'm just doing something based on what the trends are telling me. Because I've heard all of these great things about microservices and service-oriented architectures and stuff like that. If there's no goal, you don't know what you're doing. And that's a very important thing. You need to understand what the purpose is. Because it might be that, oh, a very common one is that I want to enable teams to work autonomously. Well, that's a very different thing from, say, the situation we had with, oh, I have this feature that is really high performance that it has a lot of performance requirements. Because the considerations in these two situations are very, very different. Because if I want to enable my teams to work autonomously, then the split is probably going to be like 50-50 between features, or a third of the features, or you're going to try to optimize the ownership of the different features. But in the scenario with a high performance feature, well, then maybe you should keep the main application as like the main monolith, and then just create a little side service that does this thing for you, because it may not make sense to split off all the code, because splitting is a costly thing. So you really need to have to think about how am I going to slice this cake? Who's going to have the big piece and who's going to have the small piece? Or are we going to split it so that everybody has an equal piece? It depends. So another common goal is that you want to scale a feature, as I said, like that's basically what I'm talking about here. And then another one is move ownership of features to a team. This is also a good one, where you might have had, and this can happen at many levels of the application. This happened to me not that long ago, where basically the product that I was working on was so successful that they scaled up, not the whole system, they just scaled up that part of the project. And all of a sudden we have more developers, and they kind of go, well, now we have the same problem again. It's a this keeps on happening. This is a reoccurring problem. This is where I argue that usually you end up with microservices if you have this thing happen over and over, which is the case for Netflix and Google and so forth. They have a project that is so successful that they split that project, and then the subparts, the new parts that make up this project, are also so successful, so you have to split them again and again. It's kind of like, cellular replication. You just split in half. You create two new cells over and over and over. It's exactly how it works. So when a feature grows so big that you can't have one team managing it at the same time, then you might split that as well. So let's talk about the technical impact. What is that? Well, basically, this is the thing this is the practicality of what's going to happen, and these are questions that you should be asking. This is, once again, not all of the questions. You have to cater this to, customize it to your situation. But usually, things like, how will the network calls look between the services? That's a very big question. Like how, and that basically comes down to, okay, so if I split this code up now, this monolith, into several services, how is the dependency and the network calls gonna look? Like, how is the interaction between the services gonna look? That's a practicality that you really need to figure out. What will happen if we don't split? That's also a very good and healthy question, because if someone comes in and says, oh, we have too much code, we should split it, then you should really ask, should we split? Because this is a major investment. The bigger the system, the larger the scope of this is, and it's going to take time to do this, and it's going to cost a lot of time and money to do this. You have multiple strategies to solve this. You should really ask, is this the right thing? And if it is the right thing, go ahead, but you shouldn't do this just arbitrarily. Is it the right time to split? That's also a very good question. Why? Because it might be that the developers are starting to feel the pain and they want to be a little bit ahead of time. And yeah, sure, that might work. But you might also have a lot of other big important projects going on. So if you know that the split is going to take a long time, or if you're going to have to stop releasing things for a little while until you can complete the split, well, then maybe you should ask if the timing is right, because you might have other really big projects that might be impacted or become at risk because you're splitting right now. So you need to think about that as well. How long will it take? That's also a big one. Are you gonna try to split like story by story, so you start moving features over in a iterative fashion, or are you gonna do a big rewrite? Are you gonna just stop all releasing for X amount of days, weeks, whatever, and just focus on this thing? Big, very, very important question. What will the workflow look after it is done? Basically, how is this change going to impact everybody's work? Because the goal, if we're going to assume that you're going to split because your company's growing, well, that's going to be to enable developers to work faster. And if that's not happening, well, then this is a really bad idea. What will we do with the shared code between the services? That's also a good one. This is why I keep telling people that microservices is not the answer to every question, because there is a lot of cost to having to have different services that need to communicate with each other, because they share interfaces, like the stuff that's going on between them, and they might have shared code and so forth. How are you going to deal with that? Are you going to create a common package or like a dependency that everybody includes or stuff like that? How are you going to think about it? Should we have different repositories or create a monorepo? Like the logistics, how are you going to actually deal with that? How is that going to scale? Is it a better idea to have multiple repos, one per team, or should you have everything in one code base and then just have each directory represent one area of the code? Should we stick with the same stack? Now, this is a little bit of a rare one, but it's a very valid question. If you are split, if you're just trying to make people autonomous, then maybe sticking on the same with the same stack is a good idea because you can trust that it's the same language. But if you're trying to create a highly performant service that is going to cater to some feature, then maybe having a different language is the way to go, or maybe not. Depends on your viewpoint. Now, lastly, we're going to look at how should the split look. And this is so hard that the only way I could figure out how to explain it is to show you kind of the way that I think about it. And that's where we get into the practicality of it all. So let's start by looking at this application here. So the first and foremost thing we've had come in from our external stakeholders. Our stakeholders have said, guys, things are taking too long. We're going to have to split up this code base because we have multiple teams coming in now and we need to create some type of ownership situation here. You are responsible for making this architecture happen. And then we look through all of our features because that's basically the first thing we need to do. We need to make an inventory of all the features we have. Now, we are really lucky because this is just a REST API basically. So there's a way for you to create a user, and there's some administrative endpoints here, and there's some product features and administrative features associated with that, and an order and some admin features together with that. Now, this is a very simple example, but in the reality, the work that I'm about to show you is gonna take a long time, depending on how big the system is, because you basically need an inventory of every feature in the entire system in order for you to know what you're going to split and how you're going to change that ownership. It's a big full-time job to do this. So my first thought here is that, okay, maybe we could split it out this way. Well, maybe we could associate the validation features, a thing that actually allows you to log in and get a session and register and stuff like that, with the user features, because that makes a lot of sense, right? And then that should probably be one ownership, right? Like the user is a fairly self-reliant entity of some sort, I would say, right? And then probably the same thing goes for here. Like the product features, yep, they should probably be in one repository, and the order features should probably be in one repository as well. So that's something I could do. I could do something like that. But let's have a look here. So if I have a server like this first question I need to ask now is, okay, what makes sense here? Should I move this into different repositories, or should I keep it in the same repository? Now, my argument here is that since this application is fairly small, I think that it's actually better for me to keep all of this code in the same code base and just have different ways of instantiating and starting it up, because that way I can have everything in the same repository, and I can make sure that each developer team, like, they have their own part of the application, but they're still sharing the same code. So shared code can still be maintained in the same product, right? So let's try that out. Let's take a copy paste here and say that we say users.js, and then let's just delete everything that is not part of the user feature. Let's do that. Something like that. Like so. And then let's, in the server, say something like this. Source users. And then let's create a case here. And let's take all of this. Not like that. Break. Like so. Let's do that. Something like that. So now I've made it possible for me, by use of this little app variable, to instantiate or to start different types of servers. I can start the user server, or I can start the main application. Cool. So with that said, I can do the same thing for the others as well. I can do products. And let's do that. No, this is the one that I want here. Admin products. Let's do that. Admin orders. And let's do products like so. Let's not do that. Let's do it this way. Let's do it this way. Like that. And now we want to remove the orders and we want to remove the users. Like so. So this is now the products. And then we can do this. Source products, and let's just continue this until we are done, like so. Like so. And then we can probably just rename this to orders, like so. Yes, let's do that. Orders. Let's make that. I wonder if I should make that. No, let's do that this way. Orders. There we are. So what I've basically done now is it's very simple. All I've done is to create a way for me to start the system in multiple ways. So instead of splitting this out into a multi-repository sort of thing, I've created at least the first step towards that. I've created a situation where now each of the teams can take ownership of, all right, each part of the system. So if we're now structuring our code in this fashion, we can start segmenting out different parts of it, and then they can run independent services. But something that is also worth thinking about here is that we have this thing here, which is this section here, admin order features. So this is a kind of a bad thing if you ask me, because this depends a lot on how we think about our system as a whole. Because if you are exposing administrative features in the same in the same set of endpoints, well, then this is publicly available. This is not a great thing, because now if I can access these routes here and I can access these routes here, well, that opens up an attack vector for hackers and other sorts of malicious users, and that's not a good thing either. So I can have the idea that, all right, maybe this is fine. Maybe I should just make sure that I secure up these endpoints and make sure that nobody can connect to them unless they're there's a special web UI for this or something like that you can access this through. The problem with that, though, is that kind of requires me to have these very sensitive endpoints synchronized across multiple services, so that if I want to split this out even further now, and let's say that we actually want to move it to a separate repository, well, then the knowledge of these endpoints needs to exist in each of these three places. So maybe I want to do this. Maybe I want to create an admin service instead for internal use that is going to run as a separate thing. Because I don't like these things here. Like, this is fine. Like, I can start this application and make sure that everybody knows how to do that, and knows that, oh, if you're running in any of these modes here, well, then you have just public facing URLs that you can map to. But I don't want that for the admin stuff. So let's do this. Let's do admin. And then let's just move all of those endpoints to there instead. So let's see here. That was the orders, yes. And let's do this. And that's the one. Let's move those. And there we are, yes. All right. Admin user features, admin product features, admin order features. Cool. So now I can have, I mean, I can just do this as well, of course. I can just add this in here. I can do this and say, call it admin. There we are. So now I have this shared ownership. I mean, if I wanted to have this a perfect microservice type of split or something like that, if I want to do that, then just keeping everything under one roof like this, with orders being in one service and products in one and users in one, would have probably been the way to go here. But since, as I was saying, that kind of requires me to distribute all of these very powerful endpoints that I don't want normal users to have access to, well, then this is probably a better split where, all right, so we have an admin control panel of some sort, and then the teams, like each team is going to have to take responsibility for the orders, one for the products and one for the users, and then they will have to share the admin features. Maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe I should instead create another wrapper application on top that's just that proxies requests to these different endpoints that lives in these different other services. But for now, this is probably a good idea. Once again, it very much depends on the business. Like, how are you doing business? This split might be this is a very normal split. This is how usually most of these systems evolve, but it may not be the right situation. It may not be the right thing for your specific project. So what I want you to take away from this is that splitting a code base into services like this is an enormous undertaking, and it is not something to be taken lightly. There's no way for me to show you how to do this right, because I can only give you like a mindset, and it requires lots and lots of experience to do this well. This is the sort of stuff that you have architects that do. You have people who are responsible for doing this over a very long period of time in large companies. We're talking weeks, if not months of work to figure out how to organize this. And the best tips that I can give you is to ask these sorts of questions, where you're basically, you start off by asking, what is the goal of the split? Because it's very important to know what the goal is. What technical impact will the split have? And how should the split look? How should you actually organize all the code and move the ownership to different teams? Because if you do this correctly, this would scale very well. This is a fairly good split, because the only dependency between these different services is that they have a shared connection to the admin interface, and that's one dependency. But it would be really bad if, let's say, the orders, this is a toy example, but in a real application, if you give one team ownership of the orders, they would have to coordinate pretty much all the time with the product team and the user team, because an order is just an aggregation of a product and a user, because an order always depends on a product and a user in order to exist. The user is a pretty self-reliant feature, so this split is very clean. The team that is managing this is probably going to be very, very happy, because they don't have to connect or synchronize with some other team to do their work. Same thing with the products. Like the products, they just take care of, they may have a dependency to the users, may not. It depends on how the system works. But the orders, this poor team, they're gonna be blocked all the time if they need to do this. It's because it's such a it all depends on how does your company work. I hope I've given you some insight into the thought process behind splitting a SO application. At least I've tried to do the best I can with a question that is literally as large as how do I become a really good software architect. But at least I tried. Have a great day.